Am 20. Dezember änderte ein SOS-Signal von einem der Tanker die Lage. Ein russisches Geisterschiff hatte einen Motorschaden erlitten und musste vor der Küste Schwedens ankern. Das Schiff wartete auf Hilfe, aber Stockholm schickte keine Hilfe. Es schickte kein Schlepper.
Behind me tonight is a Russian-flagged vessel now at the center of what?
Wie wir hinter mir sehen können, haben wir das russische Schiff hier rechts. Manchmal werden die größten Schlachten gewonnen, ohne einen einzigen Schuss abzugeben. Jahrelang versuchte Putin alles.
May become one of the most consequential maritime incidents in Europe's shadow war with Moscow. History shows that some of the most decisive battles are not fought with missiles or artillery, but with timing, law, and quiet force. For years, President Vladimir Putin worked relentlessly to conceal the existence of Russia's so-called shadow fleet, a covert armada designed to bypass sanctions and sustain the Kremlin's war economy. But on the night of December 20th, that carefully constructed illusion began to collapse. An emergency SOS signal from a disabled tanker forced the vessel to anchor off the Swedish coast. And what followed was not assistance, but a raid. Swedish authorities did not dispatch a tugboat. Instead, they sent customs officials backed by national special forces, signalling immediately that this was no routine maritime incident. What appeared to be mechanical failure quickly revealed itself as something far more strategic. The public unravelling of a billion-dollar covert shipping operation Moscow had spent years trying to keep hidden. The decision to board the tanker, known as the Adler, was driven by grave national security concerns. Western intelligence, reinforced by investigative reporting from CNN, had already established that many of these civilian-looking vessels were not simply transporting oil. They were operating as floating Trojan horses, carrying Russian military intelligence operatives, GRU personnel, and Wagner-linked mercenaries. Ukrainian intelligence had repeatedly warned that such ships were being used as mobile platforms to launch and control unmanned aerial vehicles over European territory. These claims were not speculative. Just one day earlier, on December 19th, Ukraine struck another Shadow Fleet tanker in the Mediterranean, reportedly killing a senior GRU commander and destroying a mobile command centre. That strike exposed the true nature of these rusting tankers, not relics of maritime trade, but active components of hybrid warfare. Swedish commandos boarding the Adler that night were not searching for oil barrels or outdated cargo. They were looking for evidence, digital records, encrypted communications, hidden drone infrastructure, and intelligence operatives embedded within the crew. The Adler was already known to Western authorities, having previously been linked to the transfer of North Korean artillery shells to Russian forces. Intelligence reports had also documented armed private security personnel aboard Shadow Fleet vessels. Individuals later revealed to be members of Russian paramilitary organisations tied to the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Wagner-affiliated groups such as Moran Security. These operatives routinely overrode ship captains, altered routes based on encrypted instructions from Moscow, and transformed commercial vessels into covert war platforms. Danish pilot reports describe Russian agents in uniform dominating ship bridges, aggressively blocking documentation and asserting absolute control. What unfolded off the Swedish coast was not an accident nor a storm-induced mishap. It was a trap, one that closed around the Kremlin's most fragile vulnerabilities, money and fear. As Swedish forces secured the vessel, the European Union moved decisively, blacklisting 41 additional Shadow Fleet ships just days before the Adler incident. That decision pushed the total number of sanctioned Russian vessels close to 600, effectively crippling a significant portion of Russia's maritime trade capacity. EU officials made their intentions unmistakably clear. Russia's Shadow Fleet is its financial lifeline and it is being cut off. For Moscow, the implications were devastating. Insurance coverage evaporated, port access vanished, and panic spread through financial and shipping circles tied to Russian energy exports. The Adler case represents a strategic collapse for Russia on three fronts. First, it marked a fundamental shift in Western maritime doctrine. For years, Moscow exploited freedom of navigation laws to shield its covert operations. That era has ended. Sweden and Denmark and Finland are now applying an environmental security doctrine, arguing that neglected, uninsured vessels pose an existential threat to the fragile Baltic ecosystem. This legal framework provides NATO countries with the authority to stop, search and seize suspect ships under the guise of technical inspections, while quietly extracting intelligence. It is Russia's own lawfare strategy turned back against it. Second, geography has become Russia's greatest enemy. The Baltic Sea is no longer a Russian backyard, but a NATO-controlled bottleneck. Every vessel leaving St. Petersburg or the Primorsk oil terminal must pass through narrow Danish straits under constant surveillance. NATO sensors track every movement beneath the water, while patrol aircraft monitor from above. Even logistical support to Kaliningrad now depends on NATO tolerance, environmental compliance and legal approval. Ukraine understood it did not need to defeat Russia's Baltic fleet directly. By turning the region into a drone-threatened war zone, it rendered shadow fleet operations economically and operationally impossible. Tankers forced to wait offshore became sitting targets, slow, defenceless and uninsurable. The third and most lethal blow came quietly from global financial centres. Maritime trade cannot function without insurance, and the seizure of vessels like the Adler sent shockwaves through the global insurance market. For insurers in London and New York, Russia's shadow fleet is no longer merely high risk, it is toxic. Without insurance, ships cannot enter ports, secure financing, or transit key straits. Transportation costs have skyrocketed, wiping out profit margins and turning Russian oil exports into a financial black hole. Russia may still be selling oil, but whether it is making money is increasingly doubtful. Taken together, the Adler incident signals something far larger than the detention of a single ship. It reveals the future of warfare itself, the weaponization of commerce. Civilian merchant vessels are no longer neutral actors. They are intelligence platforms. Drone launch sites and instruments of sabotage. Sweden's action sent a message not only to Moscow but also to Beijing, where similar tactics are being employed in the South China Sea. Commercial cover no longer guarantees immunity. What happened in the icy waters of the Baltic Sea on December 20th marked the end of an era. Russia's shadow fleet, once considered invisible and untouchable, now sails through a minefield of legal, military and financial traps. There are no safe harbours left, no neutral waters to hide in. The sea, once Moscow's escape route, is closing. And as the echoes from Brussels make clear, the message is unmistakable. The shadow fleet is being strangled, and this time there may be no way out. As analysts examine the fallout, one conclusion is becoming unavoidable. The Baltic Sea has transformed from a commercial corridor into a strategic choke point, and Russia is the party most exposed. What once functioned as a reliable artery for energy exports is now a zone of constant scrutiny, legal intervention and military risk. The Kremlin's assumption that its shadow fleet could operate indefinitely in the grey zones of international law has proven to be a critical miscalculation. Each stranded or inspected vessel compounds the pressure, sending a signal to ports, insurers and financiers worldwide that Russian-linked shipping now carries consequences far beyond profit. The ripple effects are already visible. Freight rates for Russian oil have surged, transit times have lengthened, and captains willing to take the risk are becoming scarce. Even when cargo reaches its destination, payment mechanisms are increasingly unreliable, delayed or blocked altogether. This is not the sudden collapse of a system, but a slow suffocation, one engineered through coordination rather than confrontation. Western officials privately describe it as a risk blockade, a strategy that avoids open naval conflict while achieving the same result, stopping trade. Military planners point out that this approach has altered the balance of power without firing a missile. Ukraine's role has been central, not by matching Russia ship for ship, but by demonstrating that high-value economic targets are vulnerable even far from the front lines. Long-range drone strikes on refineries and port infrastructure have expanded the battlefield into Russia's economic heartland, proving that distance is no longer protection. Once that precedent was set, every shadow fleet tanker waiting offshore became a liability rather than an asset. Beyond Europe, global capitals are watching closely. Maritime authorities in Asia, the Middle East and Africa are reassessing how they classify and inspect vessels with opaque ownership structures or irregular insurance histories. The assumption that a civilian hull guarantees civilian intent is rapidly eroding. What began as a regional response to Russia's tactics is now influencing international norms, redefining how commerce and conflict intersect at sea. For Moscow, the implications are stark. The Shadow Fleet was designed to be invisible, flexible and deniable. Instead, it has become traceable, vulnerable and politically radioactive. Each intervention, whether framed as an environmental inspection, a customs operation or a safety enforcement, chips away at the system's viability. And unlike traditional military losses, these setbacks cannot be easily replaced or concealed. As night fell over the Baltic on December 20th, the boarding of a single vessel may have seemed like a localised incident. In reality, it marked a turning point. The rules of maritime engagement have changed, and the era of untouchable ghost ships is drawing to a close. The pressure on the Kremlin is now being felt well beyond the maritime sector, bleeding directly into Russia's broader economic and political calculations. Energy exports have long been the backbone of Moscow's ability to finance prolonged conflict, stabilise its currency and maintain domestic control. But with the Shadow Fleet increasingly cornered, that backbone is weakening. Russian officials may still project confidence, yet behind closed doors, the calculus is changing. Every delayed shipment, every denied quayside port entry, and every revoked insurance policy translates into lost leverage and shrinking room to manoeuvre. At the same time, the psychological impact of the Adler incident should not be underestimated. For years, the Shadow Fleet operated on the belief that Western states would avoid direct confrontation at sea, fearing escalation. Sweden's decision to deploy special forces shattered that assumption. It demonstrated a willingness to act decisively, but within legal frameworks that leave Moscow little ground to retaliate without exposing itself further. This balance, firm action without open military engagement, has become the defining feature of the West's evolving strategy. Security experts also warn that Russia's options for response are limited and risky. Any attempt to escort Shadow Fleet vessels with naval assets would immediately raise the stakes, drawing NATO warships into closer proximity and increasing the likelihood of miscalculation. Cyber or hybrid retaliation, meanwhile, risks further sanctions and diplomatic isolation. In effect, the very tools Russia once used to operate in the grey zone are now being turned against it. What makes this moment particularly significant is the speed at which coordination has taken place. The Adler boarding was not an isolated national decision, but part of a wider alignment among Nordic countries, NATO, the European Union and intelligence partners. Information sharing has accelerated, legal interpretations have converged, and enforcement thresholds have dropped. Ships that might once have passed unchallenged are now flagged, tracked, and, if necessary, stopped. This level of unity has narrowed the gaps Russia previously exploited. Looking ahead, analysts believe this strategy will expand beyond the Baltic. Similar environmental and safety doctrines could be applied in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and even global choke points such as the Bosphorus or the Suez adjacent routes. Each application increases the cumulative pressure on Russia's export network, making workarounds more complex and more expensive. The Shadow Fleet was meant to be adaptable. Instead, it is becoming brittle. For the global maritime industry, the consequences are profound. Ship owners are rethinking opaque ownership structures. Insurers are tightening due diligence standards. Port authorities are revising risk assessments to account for hybrid threats. The line between commercial shipping and military activity, once clearly defined, is now dangerously blurred. In this new environment, neutrality is no longer assumed, it must be proven. As this story continues to unfold, one fact stands out. The night of December 20th did not simply expose a mechanical failure aboard a single tanker. It exposed a systemic vulnerability at the heart of Russia's war economy. And as the Baltic Sea grows colder and more closely watched, the space for Russia's shadow operations is shrinking. From the Baltic tonight, this is a reminder that modern conflict is no longer defined solely by front lines or firepower. It is defined by pressure, persistence, and the quiet closing of doors. The question now is not whether the Shadow Fleet can survive, but how long it can endure under a spotlight it was never designed to face.